"Ma'am, I'm here about the boot locks," Officer Rivera interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. "I've received multiple complaints about illegal vehicle immobilization." Margaret's smile faltered. "There must be some misunderstanding. As HOA president, I have full authority to enforce our regulations. May I see the paperwork authorizing you to boot vehicles on public streets?" Officer Rivera asked. "Of course, it's all in the bylaws," Margaret insisted, waving vaguely toward her house. Section 7, Paragraph 3. "That's interesting," Samira spoke up, stepping forward with a highlighted document. "Because I have the bylaws right here, and Section 7, Paragraph 3 only authorizes the HOA to issue warnings and fines, not to physically disable vehicles. And more importantly, Officer Rivera, these are city streets, not private property." The news cameras zoomed in as Officer Rivera reviewed the documents and nodded. "Ms. Wilkins, placing boot locks on vehicles without proper authority constitutes illegal vehicle tampering under state law. Additionally, collecting fees for their removal could constitute extortion." The color drained from Margaret's face as she realized she was being recorded. "This is ridiculous. I'm protecting our property values. By breaking the law?" Tom Ramirez asked loudly enough for the camera to pick up. "By preventing Mrs. Patel from getting to her dialysis." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Margaret's loyal board members began edging away from her. The Maple Terrace boot scandal became a local sensation. Footage of Margaret being served with a cease and desist order played on the evening news, alongside interviews with affected residents. By Wednesday, the mayor's office had issued a statement clarifying that HOAs cannot enforce parking laws on public streets, and the city council announced plans to review HOA regulations citywide. Within hours of the police visit, Margaret and her 2 board members were scrambling to remove the boots from all affected vehicles. The resulting emergency HOA meeting had record attendance, with residents who had never before participated showing up to voice their opinions. Margaret arrived with her attorney, a nervous man who kept dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. She attempted to maintain her composure, but when the vote for her removal passed 56-3, the only supporting votes coming from her and her 2 increasingly uncomfortable allies, she finally lost her cool. "You'll regret this," she declared, standing up abruptly. "Do you think anyone else wants this thankless job? This community will fall apart without me." "Actually," Alex said, rising from his seat, "we've already formed a transition committee. Turns out, when you don't rule by fear, people are willing to participate." In the weeks that followed, the community transformed. The new board, led by Alex and advised by Samira, revised the HOA rules to be clear, fair, and transparent. They created a community app where residents could vote on issues and share resources. Tom Ramirez organized a neighborhood watch that focused on helping elderly residents rather than policing minor infractions. Most surprisingly, Darius Washington discovered his talent for community organizing and started a monthly driveway potluck that rotated through the neighborhood, bringing together residents who had previously never spoken. Even Mrs. Patel, fully recovered and now a neighborhood celebrity, taught a popular yoga class in the community park. As for Margaret, she listed her house for sale within a month. The day she moved out, residents noticed she had a boot on her moving truck, a legitimate one this time, placed by the city for unpaid parking tickets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially when community funds that Margaret had misappropriated were recovered and used to build a children's playground. The infamous boot locks. They were auctioned off at the first annual Maple Terrace Community Festival, with proceeds going to a local transportation charity for seniors and disabled residents. A fitting reminder that sometimes the most oppressive tools can be transformed into something that truly serves the community. Margaret Wilkins had been the president of the Maple Terrace Homeowners Association for 7 years, a position she wielded with unwavering authority. At 62, with her perfectly coiffed blonde bob and perpetual scowl, she patrolled the neighborhood like a general inspecting her troops. The residents had long dubbed her HOA Karen behind her back, but no one dared challenge her directly. Not after what happened to the Johnsons when they painted their door unauthorized navy, instead of the approved colonial blue. The peaceful suburban community had functioned relatively well under her strict governance until Margaret's husband left her for a yoga instructor half his age. Residents noticed her rules becoming increasingly arbitrary and punitive after that. Her new fixation was what she called the parking situation. Despite the neighborhood having ample street parking and most homes featuring two-car garages, she insisted that cars parked on the street were eyesores that decreased property values by at least 15%, a figure she quoted without any supporting evidence. At the last HOA meeting, Tom Ramirez, a retired Army colonel, had finally spoken up. "Margaret, these restrictions are excessive. My son is home from college with his car, and where exactly do you expect him to park?" Margaret's smile had been razor-sharp. "Perhaps your son should consider public transportation, Mr. Ramirez. Or perhaps you should consider a home with more adequate parking for your family's needs." The room had fallen silent, and Tom's face had reddened as he sat back down. 3 days later, without consultation or warning, Margaret used HOA funds to purchase 20 bootlocks. On a quiet Sunday morning, while most families were at church or enjoying weekend activities, she and her 2 loyal board members methodically placed the bright yellow boots on vehicles parked on the street, including Tom Ramirez's son's used Honda Civic. Alex Chen, a 35-year-old software engineer and father of 2, was the first to discover his family's second car had been booted. Having lived in Maple Terrace for 3 years, he was familiar with Margaret's tactics, but had never experienced anything this extreme. When he called the emergency HOA number listed on the boot's warning sticker, Margaret herself answered, informing him that removal would cost $150 in cash, payable directly to her. "This is outrageous," Alex protested, pacing beside his immobilized car. "You can't just disable people's vehicles without warning." "Actually, I can," Margaret replied coolly. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the bylaws gives the board authority to enforce parking regulations. "Perhaps you should have read them more carefully before moving in." She hung up before Alex could argue further. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood's group chat. 17 families discovered their vehicles immobilized, with Margaret demanding the same release fee from each household. Videos of angry residents discovering the boots quickly circulated, including one of elderly Mrs. Patel crying because she couldn't drive to her weekly dialysis appointment. Samira Johnson, a paralegal who had recently moved to the neighborhood, was incensed. As she watched the videos, something clicked. "Wait a minute," she messaged the group. "These aren't even private roads. They're public streets maintained by the city. HOAs don't have the authority to boot vehicles on public property." By mid-afternoon, the affected residents had gathered in Alex's backyard, a covered operation they called boot camp. Tom Ramirez brought tactical maps of the neighborhood. Samira brought legal documents. And Darius Washington, a locksmith by trade, brought something even more valuable: professional insight into how those specific boot models worked. "I can't remove these without damaging them," Darius explained, examining one boot a neighbor had managed to remove with the wheel still attached. "But I can tell you these are cheap knockoffs. The real question is, do we fight fire with fire, or do we go by the book?" The group debated their options, tension building as evening approached and several residents still couldn't get to work the next day. That's when Samira stood up with a gleam in her eye. "I think I know how we can do both." Monday morning arrived with a flurry of activity. Samira had spent the previous evening researching state laws and discovered not only that Margaret's actions were unlawful, but that they violated 3 specific statutes. Armed with this knowledge, Alex filed a formal police report while Tom Ramirez contacted local news stations with footage of the boots, including Mrs. Patel missing her medical appointment.